This is Brian Chen, staff attorney at NELP, the National Employment Law Project. This is Lauren Gurley, who is a writer with Vice on the labor beat. And at the end there is Larry Goldbetter, who is president of the National Writers Union. So why don't we just start off by each of you taking a turn to just talk, say your reactions to the film and how these kinds of issues relate to the work that you do. Do you want to go first, Brian?
Sure, thank you. I was really blown away by this movie. I thought it was really moving and powerful, and what I'm really struck by is the desperation and insecurity that it really portrays of the husband and the wife, really. And it really reflects this issue that we at NELP and that I work with quite a lot, which is misclassification, where employers create this fiction that everyone is their own boss, no one is an employee. You remember the scene where they say you're not getting hired, you're getting onboarded. There's all these little fictions that add up to you're not quite an employee. And the real effect of that, at least in the US, I'm not sure how it is in the UK, is that you're called an independent contractor rather than an employee. You are not getting any of the protections of minimum wage, or overtime, or workers' compensation, and you don't have the ability to form a labor union. So it's this really radical reshaping of what the kinds of protections and rights that people can expect to have at work. And so I was really left with just the level of insecurity that this person is in. And they always say that these independent contractors, they love their flexibility, they love the independence of it. But I don't know how anyone could watch this movie and think this person is anything but independent. He's rushing everywhere. He's always trying to beat the deadline.
He's a slave to the gun.
Exactly. And so there's all these kinds of, they say that you don't have a boss, you don't have a supervisor, but it's really the app and the gun that really controls him. And so the forms of power may have changed, but the power imbalance still is there.
Yeah, so as Alexandra mentioned, I am a labor reporter and I talk to lots of gig workers all day long. I think what this movie gave me a lot more insight. I don't really see this level of intimacy. Usually when I talk to workers on the phone for maybe 10 or 20 minutes or even, I don't really gain access to that. So I found it extremely sad and depressing. As Brian was saying, there's sort of two narratives about, what it means to be a gig worker. One of them is glorified by tech companies. You have lots of flexibility. You can be your own boss. You have your own business. And then there's the other side, which is what I cover and what I definitely see as being more of the reality, which is that you are sort of a slave to a corporation, but with none of the benefits that are typically afforded to workers. As Brian mentioned, most labor protections that we fought to gain in the past century have just sort of evaporated, and working conditions are very similar to, I guess because this was set in England, I was thinking about the Industrial Revolution and sort of being on a clock and sort of scientific management of people's time and stuff like that, and trying to push workers, squeeze out like all of that they can be productive for, working 14-hour days. And so, I think, overall I felt like this really resonated from what I'm hearing from workers, especially in the United States as well.
Yeah, powerful is the word. I was also blown away by this, and the thing I wrote down first was scanner, and it's such a powerful thing, as the movie, develops, and everybody is trying to do the best they can. At one point or another, they all say, "I'm doing the best I can," and they're all sorry, but they're these people are struggling, you know, to make a living. You know, there was one scene in there where the wife is visiting a woman and she's talking about the miners' strike in the mid-80s. And that's pretty significant. The miners' strike was to the UK what the air traffic controller strike was to the US labor movement. It was a turning point. And those miners were at war, fighting for their lives. And Thatcher did everything she can, and she beat them. She beat them down. And from then on, it was downhill for the labor movement. Very similar with Reagan and the traffic controllers. It was the same period of time. And what you see here on this film is the result of that. That's the end result of what we saw then. And, you know, it's workers without a union. It's everybody trying to fight on their own. And it's impossible. It's just impossible. And, you know, a long time ago, I worked at a Ford plant in Detroit, and I worked for Dirty Bastard #1. And this guy was really a mean bastard. And I remember one guy, he couldn't open his hands. The line was moving so fast. And this guy, Boris, you know, said the guy was in the hole. So Boris was giving him a real hard time. The guy held up his hands and he said, "I'm doing the best I can." And Boris said, "Don't do the best you can, do the fucking job." And the difference was we had a union. We had a union and we had the power to fight back. And now, today, millions of workers don't have that power. They're robbed of that power. And this is the result. And, you know, there are millions of workers in this situation, in here and all around the world, many in worse shape, actually. So, you know, I think the moral of the story is you have to organize.
Can you talk about how the gig economy is affecting the writers, since you're with the National Writers Union?
Sure, we represent freelance writers, and I would say, you know, they're not covered by any labor laws. We're considered independent contractors. We're considered a business. If we try and organize, we're threatened with antitrust violations, actually. And probably one of the main things that we handle are group grievances at different publications for non-payment and late payment. And this is just the standard in the industry. People are contracted to write pieces, they do the research, they write the piece, they turn it in, it's published, then they just don't get paid. And I would say last year we collected over $250,000 for freelancers who had been unpaid. And I might add, that's without having collective bargaining, without having a contract with these publishers, but by organizing those unpaid writers to stick together. And another thing we're trying, yeah, that's cool. We have a few members here tonight. And, you know, another thing we're trying to do is set standards in the industry. So freelancers are the fast food workers of the publishing industry. And there's no floor, there's no bottom. So there are writers working for less than minimum wage. There are writers working for literally pennies a word. And so what we're trying to do is get agreements with publications to set a floor in the industry, set the basic that we can build on. And then we're very active in trying to pass legislation against misclassification that Ben was referring to, that, you know, since the financial crisis of 2008, 25% of newsroom workers have lost their jobs. And income for writers in the past decade has gone down about 60%. And meanwhile, there are zillions of people trying to make a living as freelancers, and they just can't do it. So we're trying to pass legislation that would require big publishing companies to pay the taxes that they have to pay for unemployment insurance, for workers' compensation, that workers would be covered by minimum wage. And that's a big long-term struggle. That's the struggle we're in.
And Lauren, you're a member of the Writers Guild East, right? Yep, so you can talk about that as a journalist, and then maybe you could talk about the Instacart workers or the Amazon workers or any of these stories that you've written lately.
Sure. So I'm fortunate enough to be in a union as well. And prior to this job that I had at Vice, I was a contractor for the New Republic, where I had, was making about minimum wage and was excluded from the union. I can say that now the contract that we have at Vice is extremely strong. It's a living, it's a real, I feel like I'm in part of the middle class. I can afford to pay my rent and stuff like that, which is a rare thing to be able to say as a reporter in New York. So I'm really grateful for the Writers Guild and the union at Vice. In terms of gig workers that I cover, I have been focusing a lot recently on grocery delivery workers, so workers on apps like Instacart and Shipt, which I'm writing a big piece that's coming out tomorrow about Shipt, which is a gig worker app that's owned by Target. It has over 100,000 workers in the US, and a lot of the things that were going on in this movie I hear about from workers. I was talking to a worker today who almost got kicked off the app, in essence fired for bringing her daughter with her to work when she had to stay home from school. I think that I hear all the time about workers peeing in bottles. That is extremely common for food delivery workers. A lot of restaurants and a lot of, because they're contractors, their bosses need to provide a bathroom, and a lot of restaurants look at gig workers as second-class citizens and will literally post signs on the door or in the app saying, please do not use our restrooms. So I think that is something that I see a lot. And then in terms of timing is a huge thing, trying to fill orders and feeling like you're constantly surveilled because the app can track you and your whereabouts. They always know where you are, is a big concern that I see a lot among workers. And then I think this thing about algorithms, which is sort of a hot topic, but people talk about it a lot. The harder you work and the better you are at your job, typically the higher ratings you get and the better pay you get and the better orders you get, and basically the harder you work, you have to be working constantly to be able to do well on these apps. Otherwise, you get worse orders. You get matched with, customers that you don't want. So it's sort of the system where you're forced to work as hard as you possibly can, as many hours as possible to get, to be able to earn a living. I think another big thing is debt. Going into debt, I hear a lot about from Uber drivers or anyone who owns a car and uses it to work. I think as someone mentioned, you're never compensated for gas, you're never compensated for wear and tear. If you get into an accident, if someone beats you up while you're which I've heard Lyft driver and Uber drivers be beat up while they're out on the job, you go thousands of dollars into debt. None of that is the company's responsibility. And so I think, basically there has been a major, with this loophole, the independent contractor loophole, these companies are making a ton of money and getting away with, treating workers the way that no employee could be treated under the current labor laws that we have.
And Brian, I know maybe some of you heard about AB 5 out in California, and I think there's some law discussion here in New York. Could you fill people in on that? And then maybe we'll take some questions from the audience.
Yeah, and I'll just back up and say that as much as this movie is about the gig economy and the kind of future of work that people frame it as, there's probably a version of this movie that exists where Abby is the main protagonist, the wife. And she's a home care worker, and that is one of the occupations that is very similar to the husband, where it's also misclassified. You're not an employee. They call it a contract, but we would call it an independent contractor. And similarly, her employer would not be responsible to her because she would be considered a contractor. And so it's, I just want to remind people that as we talk about the future of work and the gig economy, there really is no gig economy that's separate from the larger economy. And Abby really is just as much a victim of this issue as the husband is. But you were talking about California, and there's a bill that is called, so I should back up. The reason that employers can do this is that there is a lot of poorly defined law on who gets to be an employee versus an independent contractor in the law. So it's typically, there's a multi-factor balancing test that looks at things like elements of control. Did you sign a contract stating that you're an independent contractor or not? But it's not very well defined, and courts don't really say how much you should weigh one factor or another. And so because it's so poorly defined, employers can just say, well, I think this person is an independent contractor, and it's very difficult for a person to assert otherwise and say, no, I'm an employee and I have a certain set of rights and protections. So what California has done last year is essentially to pass a law that sets a new standard for who gets to be classified as an employee or an independent contractor. And rather than that confusing multi-factor balancing test that's poorly defined and not even courts know how to use it, it's just a three-factor test that looks at the elements of control, various elements of control, and it assumes that a person is an employee versus an independent contractor. And that there is a rebuttable presumption that if a company wants to say, no, this person really is an independent contractor, the burden of proof is on that company to say so. And so, as you mentioned, we're doing this here in New York. Larry and I are part of a group that's called the New York Direct Coalition, and we're advocating for our state lawmakers to pass a similar kind of bill that ultimately addresses this issue of misclassification in a way that is respectful and mindful of certain occupations that may be differently situated, but ultimately that we are addressing the core issue of misclassification and holding employers accountable to their workers.
Okay. So, questions from the audience? Yeah, okay, the mic. There's a gentleman here in the front, second row here, and then we'll go to you. Yeah.
I've been a freelancer all my career. I thought this all started with Microsoft, actually. And I thought they lost a big case over this particular issue. I guess I'm mistaken.
I don't know what you're...
But Microsoft started the whole independent contractor thing in the early 2000s. And I thought they were sued and they lost. I thought that was a big case, but I just misunderstood that.
The independent contractors really go back for decades, past the 2000s.
19. And this, so there is no federal law, they're all state-by-state laws in terms of qualifying, because I thought things of control, what someone tells you you have to come in at a certain time, you have to do certain things, that they are in effect, you are an employee of theirs, you're not only in a contract.
Well, there are federal laws relating to employee and independent contractors, such as like the IRS has a test for it. The issue really is that at the state level, it's the state that determines a minimum wage, for example. So New York did a really great thing and increased their minimum wage to $15, which they should have done a long time ago. But they finally did it. The problem is that a lot of people who are misclassified and who are independent contractors, because it's the state that passed that minimum wage and the state has that poorly defined test, they don't get any of the benefits of that minimum wage increase. And that's really just one example. So a lot of it is the patchwork of states, and that's why it's so important to have a more uniform, clear set of standards.
The thing that struck me the most, those people are in England, so when the husband gets beaten up, that health care is free. And you can't watch this film or be a freelancer or watch a movie like Parasite and not think that the whole paradigm needs to be readdressed, because people's, I mean, you know, it's a film, but it is real life also. It's happening to people you know, to yourself, and it's kind of frightening.
Yeah. Yeah, in the back. Okay, go ahead.
One of the things that I can see in the movie is that focuses mainly on a specific subject. It doesn't include other unions and unions that are already selling workers in general. Even if there are some unions that are in society, these unions tend to maintain the corruption that exists in the system. So my question is, what is that needs to be done? Because it's also, there are a lot of people who are not able, like people who are working in labor days, okay, where they cannot get any union or be organized by anybody. It is very hard for them to find a union that will represent them. The movie is not only just touch the issue, but it's also the family as a whole. You see the problems of the boy, the problems of the girl, and they want to spend more time, which is what it is a psychological problem that exists within society. But nevertheless, I like to see what is your idea about the unions that are not able to serve members of the working class.
Anybody want to take that? I think you mean there are a lot of people who aren't eligible to join a union? Yeah. This is true. I mean, the labor law has not been revised since, what, 47, and it was a really bad one. Taft-Hartley, right? Has there been anything since then?
I mean, my personal opinion is that we are somewhat in this state of affairs because of the way that the unions responded to the attacks or didn't respond to the attacks when they were happening. That said, we are in this situation, and there really is no substitute for organizing. And any major change in legislation that's ever happened, you know, whether it's around civil rights, voting rights, the ability to organize unions, those things were won in the streets first and then legislated. And I see no substitute. We have to organize. And you may not be eligible to join a union, but nobody can stop you from trying to organize with your coworkers. And that's what we need to do.
When it gets really hard is when there's some, a Walmart or a Target or one of these corporations that has so many thousands of employees over so many different stores and states and locations. It's really, really hard to organize. No.
I'll just add that it's the federal labor law around collectively bargaining is the National Labor Relations Act, and it explicitly excludes independent contractors from the protections of the NLRA. It only applies to employees. And so part of it is, to your point, clarifying or reforming that act to say that, to have a better definition of who gets to be called an employee and therefore has the right to organize and to have a labor union. And I should say, it was, I believe, last week that the House passed legislation called the Protect the Right to Organize Act, which would do exactly that, which is to reform the NLRA, to pass the ABC test, which is what the California bill did, and that would reform the National Labor Relations Act and capture much more people who were eligible to be employees, classified as employees, and therefore get the benefits of a union.
I would also add just one thing, piggybacking off of them, that unions are great, but a lot of workers in this more fragmented sort of gig economy setting have been organizing and winning big things without unions. There are a lot of worker centers who sort of are fronts for unions that take on this role. If you think about McDonald's workers and the Fight for 15, that was without a union, but gig workers have been organizing, Google workers have been organizing, all without unions. So yeah, organizing, you can still organize, you still have the right to organize, even though you can't join a union.
Another question?
Hello.
Yep.
I'm a proud member of IATSE, and for 100 years we've had great union contracts. I understand it takes 3.5% of the population to affect change. So where can we go? Where can we start? Is there an app for that?
No answer?
I don't know where we got the figure 3%. To create change at 3.5%.
Well, what is union
What is what?
membership? What is union membership in this country?
I think private sector is about 7%, and public
It's like 10 or
sector is
11.
like 10 or 11. Yeah.
Hi, I work in the trucking industry. And it's been one of the most profound changes in terms of structural labor shift over the last 40 years, beginning with the regulation in the late 80s. So if you think about the Uber driver or people depicted in this film, it's probably 10 times worse for truckers who are independent contractors because you're basically misled through all kinds of disinformation and very structured third-party arrangements to stay well within reach, or rather out of reach of employee-employee relations. And if you look at this stuff, there's a really good book about it that was published a few years ago. You can't help but look at all the trucking media as being really conspiratorial-minded. Like Walmart, really large retailer, big motor truck carrier as well. Most everybody they work with are independent contractors. And you want the work, so you lease the truck, and you're on the hook. And all these people, they end up paying for trucking school, and they're kind of, it's basically a modern day of indentured servitude. It's really quite terrible. I just hope that some of you folks look into this, you've written about it, because it's something which is really getting a lot worse with increased crash rates and costs of crashes as well, but it seems to get taken up more by the Uber and the local delivery stuff because it affects us more on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, there's an amazing USA Today series from 2 years ago, I think, by Brett Murphy about the port truck drivers in LA. I mean, it's incredible and heartbreaking, exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
So I was just wondering if anybody wanted to address the role of the consumer, because now we can have same-day delivery, next-day delivery, and how that's impacting all of this.
Yeah. Have you considered that in your pieces, Lauren?
The role of consumer? Yeah, I think there is, I think as an individual consumer, you don't have a lot of power. Like, I'm not one to believe that you not subscribing to Amazon Prime really makes a huge difference in the long term. I think like boycotts make a difference, and sort of bigger mass actions make a difference. Obviously, I think it's important to stand in solidarity with workers if they're going on strike, or if they're picketing, or if they're asking something of customers. One thing that I think is extremely important in terms of these apps is always tipping, and always tipping well, like 20-25%. A lot of times people just go through the motions on Uber or Lyft and don't add a tip. I know I've used to do that. Like, it's hard to realize how important that is to workers and how significant it is in their paychecks, like, because of all of these, apps, like, sort of tinkering with their algorithmic pay models. Like, pay has significantly gone down for a lot of people, and tips makes a huge difference.
And I think the movie really showed that. There's that scene where the boss or the supervisor is saying, they don't care about you, they care about the price, they want the parcel within 3 days. And so there are conveniences that we have now that didn't exist before, but it comes at a cost, which is this invisible workforce that people really don't see, and it really is, people really need to be aware of that.
Yeah.
We're actually going to go right here.
Oh,
Question. What is your thoughts about the Freelancers and Free Act?
Well, we helped to get it passed, and we think it's a start. It was mainly led by the Freelancers Union, and we were part of that. We think it's an important step forward, but it's clearly not, it doesn't answer all the needs of freelancers. And just this year, it was extended to an anti-discrimination law for freelancers. Originally, this was passed at the same time as Freelancers Are Free, but it didn't go into effect until this past year. So that now, in New York City, freelancers are covered under anti-discrimination laws that previously only applied to workers. And we're trying to initiate with the Freelancers Union, Freelancers Are Free on a statewide basis, and we're looking into where we can spread it to other cities as well.
Getting back to your question, your comment about healthcare workers, there is a crisis in New York already, and I don't know what happened to the movement. It just seems to be stalled for many years, and is there a way to kind of, right now all these groups seems to be fragmented. They have their own fight, each of them have their own fight. Is it possible to kind of organize these people more or less that people could support it? Seems like to me for the last 40 years, we are unable to raise the people up, and it ends up pushing everybody down.
Big questions. Yes, no, it's very true. Yeah. Oh, the mic's over there.
First, I just wanted to apologize for the technical glitches. BetaWorks always has a seamless operation, and this is a very rare exception. And then now I want to ask a question. Brian, Larry, and Alex, are there anything, what are your organizations doing in the months leading up to the election? Are there any particular actions or organization that you're taking on?
Well, I suppose I can start. So I was saying earlier, we're part of this coalition in New York that is working to advocate for something similar to what California did with their Assembly Bill 5. And so what we hope to accomplish in the short term is to really address misclassification here in New York and to establish an ABC test for all workers in the state. Because it really is reaching quite a crisis. And there were some new numbers that came out recently that said if you focus only on gig workers, you're really only hitting maybe 1 in 5 workers who are receiving very low wages and are called independent contractors. And so it's a much bigger problem than gig work. And we are trying to get legislation that really lifts up and restores the rights of all of those workers who aren't misclassified in the state.
Larry, do you want?
Yeah, I think this campaign to pass this legislation in New York State is extremely important. It's one of our big priorities, and we're part of the United Auto Workers, and we're having a lobby conference, an annual lobby conference in Albany, beginning of March, and this is one of the things we're going to be working hard for. In terms of the national elections, we just had a project up in New Hampshire that our union took part in, where people went up there and basically, they were able to campaign for whoever they were for, because the union hasn't made any endorsements or anything like that. But, mainly trying to get people active around the issues. And the issues are big, and I would begin to get into it now. It's a whole other discussion, which way the election's going to go, or what the obstacles are, whatever. But I think one thing is that there are a lot of young people being mobilized right now, and that's a very positive thing, and we want to be part of that.
This is last question. Okay.
The unions have been instrumental in getting medical coverage for not just union members, but for people who work for corporations as well. The union sets it and then the corporations follow suit, because it's important to keep good workers. Can I assume that the unions are supporting Medicare for all and candidates who support Medicare for all?
I wouldn't assume that.
No.
Not in Nevada.
In fact, it's an issue. It's an issue that people are struggling over. And a lot of unions are resisting doing that.
Because they have bargained over healthcare for so long and have really good healthcare. So there's real tension there about giving that up. Hmm?
Management of the unions who want to pocket the healthcare industry.
I don't know.
The rank and file is pretty much on Medicare for all.
Okay. All right, well, thank you all so much.